On the damp evening of 31st July 1889, under the lamps of St. George's Hall, Liverpool, the American-born Mrs. Florence Maybrick pauses at a small table outside the courtroom and smooths the folded edge of a letter she is not allowed to send. The stone is cool beneath her gloved hand. Beyond the doors, jurymen adjust their cuffs and reporters test their ink. Inside one notebook, a journalist has already written the caption that will trail her name for decades. The beautiful young wife accused of poisoning her husband with arsenic from flypapers. She straightens her posture, the old lesson from European schools, and pulls her gloves tighter over her wrists, a tiny ritual of composure learned long before Mobile or Liverpool became headlines. In her memoir, written years later in America, she would call these years her 15 lost ones. Tonight, the rustle of silk and the scratch of legal pens blend into one question. How much of a woman's grace can be used as evidence against her? The answer, for Florence, will cost almost everything. In late spring 1875, in a rented apartment off the Königstrasse in Stuttgart, a 13-year-old Florence Elizabeth Chandler leaned over a small escritoire, copying out French phrases in a careful, sloping hand. Her mother, Caroline Chandler Dewberry, now Baroness von Roques, has brought her daughters from Mobile, Alabama to Europe after marrying a German cavalry officer in 1872, hoping that a continental education will polish them for an international marriage market. The decision represents a pattern familiar among ambitious Southern families in the post-Civil War years. Displaced wealth seeking European refinement, American capital pursuing Old World credentials. The room smells faintly of starch and coal smoke. Beyond the window, the sounds of Stuttgart's commercial district drift upward, carriage wheels on cobblestones, the call of street vendors, church bells marking the hour. A German governess corrects Florence's posture with 2 fingers between shoulder blades. Penmanship, languages, music, and graceful silence form the quiet curriculum of a girl whose father, William George Chandler, had been a banker and one-time mayor back in Mobile before his death. In the hierarchy of Southern society, the Chandlers had occupied respectable standing. The move to Europe both preserved and transformed that status. An early biographical pamphlet later noted that her handwriting and languages were excellent, evidence of years spent in European schools for upper-class girls. The script she practices, loops carefully controlled, capitals elegantly flourished, represents more than penmanship. It is a form of social currency, each properly addressed envelope a small transaction in the economy of reputation. Letters become her first social instrument, thank you notes to hostesses, dutiful lines to relations in Alabama, each folded and sealed with the precision of a lesson completed. The education Florence receives in these years follows a specific template: German efficiency in deportment, French refinement in conversation, English restraint in emotional display. She learns which fork to use at elaborate dinners, how to enter a drawing room without drawing undue attention, when to speak, and when graceful silence serves better. Music lessons teach her to play for others' entertainment without displaying unseemly ambition. Language instruction emphasizes not literature, but social fluency, the ability to compliment a hostess in her native tongue, to understand the subtle gradations of address that mark rank and intimacy. Already, the lines between affection and performance blur. Every carefully written letter is also a small audition for a future she does not yet choose. The apartment in Stuttgart, like other stopping points in the sisters' continental education, serves as both school and showcase. Visitors from America, traveling through European capitals, call to assess how well the Chandler girls are being prepared. Each visit is a kind of inspection, each social accomplishment recorded in the mental ledgers that will later inform marriage negotiations. Years afterward, Florence would recall these periods with ambivalence. The education gave her tools, languages, cultural literacy, the ability to move between American frankness and European formality. Yet it also trained her in a fundamental deception, the art of appearing effortlessly graceful while every gesture followed careful calculation. The same disciplined hand that copies French verbs will one day write a letter called compromising in a British court. its elegant script used as evidence of calculated deception rather than desperate honesty. On 12th of March 1880, aboard the White Star liner S. Baltic, somewhere in the mid-Atlantic between New York and Liverpool, the saloon lamps swung gently as 18-year-old Florence adjusted her pale gloves and stoops to rescue a fallen calling card. The card belongs to James Maybrick, a Liverpool cotton merchant in his early 40s, recently returned from work in Norfolk, Virginia. The encounter appears accidental, the dropped card, the polite retrieval, but in the confined social world of first-class transatlantic travel, few meetings happen entirely by chance. The Baltic, launched in 1871, represents the pinnacle of White Star Line luxury, a vessel of 3,707 tons carrying passengers between the Old World and the New, in accommodations that range from elegant saloons to steerage. In first class, where Florence and her mother travel under the title Baroness von Roques and daughter, the journey becomes a mobile season, a compressed marriage market where American heiresses and European gentlemen, English merchants and continental nobility meet under circumstances that encourage rapid intimacy. The ship's passenger manifest, preserved in Liverpool archives, shows both their names, documenting the beginning of a relationship that newspapers would later describe with words like shipboard romance and whirlwind courtship. Passengers would later tell reporters that they were startled to see a girl of 17 or 18 walking the deck alone with a man more than 20 years her senior. Yet the pairing fit a familiar Gilded Age pattern. In those years, age gaps of 20 or even 30 years raised fewer eyebrows when the man brought financial security and the woman brought youth, beauty, and social accomplishment. The economic logic was transparent. Florence, educated and refined, but without substantial independent wealth, represented an excellent prospect for a self-made merchant seeking to elevate his social standing. James, established in the cotton trade with connections spanning Liverpool and Virginia, offered the security that Florence's mother had been carefully positioning her daughters to secure. In the ship's passenger lists and later pamphlets, she appears as a Southern belle, her mother as Baroness von Roques, bound for a tour of Europe's fashionable resorts. The titles matter. The von Roques designation, acquired through Caroline's marriage to the German officer, confers a patina of European aristocracy that enhances the family standing. It suggests connections, breeding, familiarity with continental customs, all valuable assets in negotiations that balance American capital against European cachet. Each evening, Florence writes short notes in her cabin, fragments of impressions perhaps, to send back to relatives in Mobile. The pen scratches over paper as the ship pushes east. Outside, waves slap the iron hull and the lamps burn low over red velvet and silver. These letters, if they survive, remain private. What reaches public record are the observations of fellow passengers, the notes in ship's rosters, the later reconstructions by journalists seeking to understand how a Southern girl and a Liverpool merchant came to a marriage that would end in scandal. The voyage takes roughly 10 days in good weather. In that compressed time, relationships that might ordinarily unfold over months of carefully chaperoned calls and formal dinners instead accelerate. The ship creates its own social rules: morning walks on deck, afternoon tea in the saloon, evening entertainments where passengers perform for one another. Florence's European education serves her well here. She can converse in French with continental travelers, discuss literature with English passengers, navigate the complex etiquette of shipboard society where proximity forces interaction but convention demands propriety. By the time the Baltic docks at Liverpool in late March, the couple have already planned a wedding the following summer, their romance neatly aligned with class expectations and transatlantic capital. The relationship, begun over a dropped calling card in the Atlantic swells, has been negotiated, assessed, and arranged with a speed that seems romantic, but follows careful calculation. Before she ever enters an English drawing room, her future is already written, in society columns and shipboard gossip, rather than her own diary. On 27 July 1881, in St. James's Church, Piccadilly, London, Florence Chandler, aged 18, gave up her American citizenship to marry James Maybrick, Catholic-turned-Anglican cotton broker of Liverpool. The wedding, reported as fashionable in both British and American papers, marks the culmination of the voyage that began in the ship's dining saloon 16 months earlier. The ceremony takes place in one of London's most prestigious parishes, a church whose register includes aristocrats, diplomats, and the wealthy merchant class that increasingly dominates Victorian England. British law at the time required foreign women marrying British subjects to assume their husband's nationality, a legal transformation that parallels the social one. Florence, who had grown up hearing stories of mobile society and received an education designed to make her marriageable across national boundaries, now becomes formally English. The change is more than symbolic. It affects property rights, legal standing, and, as she will later discover, her vulnerability to English law and English courts. The marriage settlement, though its exact terms do not survive inaccessible archives, would have followed conventional patterns. James, as the husband, assumed control of any property Florence brought to the marriage. Her rights, her assets, her future security, all now depended on his management and goodwill. The legal doctrine of coverture, though gradually eroding in this period, still meant that a married woman existed largely as an extension of her husband in the eyes of the law. By March 1884, after a period divided between Norfolk, Virginia, and England, the couple settled into Battlecrease House in Aigburth, a red brick villa with gardens sloping towards the Mersey. The house, built in the substantial Victorian style, sits in a district favored by Liverpool's prosperous merchant class. Aigburth occupies a particular social niche, respectable, comfortable, aspirational, but not aristocratic. Its residents are the men who built fortunes in cotton, shipping, and banking, new money creating old comforts, professional ambition masquerading as settled gentility. Battlecrease House itself embodies these contradictions. Flush toilets and gas lighting signal modernity. Imported furnishings and careful decoration suggest a cultivation. The drawing room, the dining room, the morning room, each space serves a specific social function, staging particular performances of domestic respectability. Gardens, maintained by hired staff, provide settings for afternoon strolls and outdoor entertaining. The architecture of the house imposes its own discipline: rooms for public display, rooms for private family life, rooms for servants whose labor makes the whole performance possible. Their son, James Chandler Maybrick, Bobo, was born in March 1882, followed by Gladys Evelyn in June 1886. The children appear in baptismal records and later genealogies, the human proof of a union that already shows strain. The spacing of the births, a typical interval for the period, marks Florence's fulfillment of expected maternal duties. In Victorian middle-class ideology, motherhood represented women's highest calling, yet the actual work of childcare was largely delegated to servants. Florence's role involves supervision, moral instruction, and appearance at appropriate moments, the presentation of motherhood rather than its exhausting daily practice. Servants like nurse Alice Yap and a staff of maids move quietly through the high-ceilinged rooms. The household employs several domestic workers, a cook, housemaids, the children's nurse, possibly a gardener and coachman. Their presence is documented in census records and later trial testimony, revealing the infrastructure necessary to maintain appearances of effortless gentility. Alice Yap, hired in 1886 to care for the children, emerges in court records as a figure of considerable importance, loyal to the household hierarchy, suspicious of her mistress, ultimately instrumental in Florence's prosecution. Florence's days are filled with calling cards, menu planning, and the endless writing of notes, invitations, regrets, letters home. The rhythm of social obligations structures time: morning calls, afternoon teas, evening dinners, seasonal balls, and race meetings. In local society pages, Mrs. Maybrick is recorded at balls and race meetings, always beautifully dressed, the American wife who has, on the surface, adapted flawlessly. The Liverpool Mercury and other local papers chronicle her appearances in their society columns, documenting her successful performance of the role she has been trained to play. Yet her diary, later quoted in her memoir, recalls a husband already preoccupied with medicine, powders, and frequent absences. James Maybrick's consumption of patent medicines and arsenic-based tonics, extensively documented during the trial, began well before Florence's arrival in his life. Fowler's solution, a popular arsenic tonic, was among his regular remedies. He consulted multiple doctors, complained of various ailments, and self-medicated with substances that contemporary medicine regarded as therapeutic, but later generations would recognize as dangerous. The stage set is grand, but the script is tightening. Behind the polished door of Battlecrease House, arsenic bottles accumulate in cupboards while calling cards pile neatly on silver trays. The juxtaposition defines Florence's life in these years. Public performance of marital harmony masking private dysfunction, social success concealing emotional isolation, elegant surfaces barely containing toxic depths. On a cold morning in January 1885, in the front drawing room of Battlecrease House, the fire burns low in the grate, while Florence practices what no school formally names the choreography of the English hostess. Coal smoke mixes with the faint scent of beeswax polish. Outside, frost patterns the windows, and the Mersey mist hangs heavy over the gardens. The servants have left fresh calling cards on a silver tray. Florence sits at a small writing table, composing responses under the watchful eye of her mother during a visit from the continent. Each envelope bears the neat script she honed in European classrooms. The writing implements matter, good paper with a subtle watermark, proper ink that will not fade or blot, a penmanship that conveys both education and character. Every note follows prescribed formulas, the correct salutation, the appropriate expression of gratitude or regret, the closing that balances warmth with propriety. These are not simply letters, but performances of social competence, small demonstrations that Florence understands the codes governing Liverpool society. The etiquette of calling, minutely regulated in this period, required constant attention. Morning calls, made between 3 and 5 in the afternoon, despite the name, lasted exactly 15 minutes. A married woman left 3 cards, one of her own and 2 of her husband's. The cards themselves conveyed messages through subtle variations. A turned-down corner indicated a personal visit rather than a servant's delivery. Cards left for multiple family members signaled different degrees of intimacy. Florence's days involved tracking these details, remembering which families require visits, which invitations demand acceptance, which social debts need acknowledgement. Household account books and later trial evidence show that the Maybricks kept several servants, including Alice Yap, nurse, whose wages and presence testify to a household of some complexity. The financial records, examined during the trial for evidence of Florence's alleged extravagance, reveal the costs of maintaining respectability. Servants' wages, groceries, coal, gas lighting, maintenance of clothing and household linens, children's needs, and social entertainment. The budget, managed by James but executed by Florence, requires constant negotiation between aspiration and available resources. The etiquette manuals of the time, many of which survive in Liverpool's collections, urged married women to maintain a graceful reserve, to move like well-run machinery, never revealing strain. Publications like Cassell's Household Guide and Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management prescribe detailed instructions for every aspect of domestic life. A lady should be quietly efficient, managing servants without appearing to labor, entertaining guests without seeming to strain household resources, maintaining her appearance without obvious artifice. The ideal was effortless perfection, a standard that required enormous effort to sustain. Florence's letters from this period do not survive in full, but her later memoir admits that she strove to conform in every particular to English expectations. The phrase suggests the pressure she felt as an American in English society, always aware of her foreign origin, conscious that her acceptance depended on flawless performance. American directness needed to be tempered with English reserve. Southern warmth had to be calibrated against Liverpool propriety. The skills acquired in Stuttgart and practiced aboard the Baltic now faced their daily test in drawing rooms where any misstep might be noted, discussed, remembered. Each neatly folded note, each perfectly timed afternoon call, is both duty and reassurance, evidence that the American wife can occupy her appointed place. Yet every ritual of politeness also confirms her dependence. She holds no independent income, controls no property, cannot travel or make major decisions without her husband's consent or knowledge. The social world she navigates so carefully exists entirely at his sufferance. The calling cards, the morning calls, the careful correspondence, all these activities take place within a structure where she possesses visibility but limited power. The more fluently she writes the language of British society, the more difficult it becomes to speak in her own name. Etiquette, ostensibly about smoothing social interaction, also functions as control. The prescribed phrases, the regulated visits, the careful gradations of intimacy and distance, these create a world where genuine feeling must be constantly translated into acceptable forms, where authentic expression risks social punishment. In later testimony, various Liverpool society women would describe Florence as charming, well-mannered, appropriate in all observable ways. None mentioned intimate friendship. The social structure Florence navigated created countless acquaintances, but few confidants. Calling card relationships, governed by protocol and performance, rarely deepened into trust. And trust, as Florence would discover, required speaking in her own voice rather than in socially prescribed phrases. The handwriting that secures her place in Liverpool society will later be enlarged on courtroom easels as proof of her guilt. The same elegant script that demonstrates her education and refinement will be scrutinized for evidence of calculation, her careful phrases reread as signs of duplicity. In the trial to come, prosecutors will present her letters not as desperate attempts at communication within a failing marriage, but as exhibits proving her capacity for deception. The social accomplishment that should have protected her will instead be weaponized against her, grace itself becoming a form of evidence. By summer 1886, with Gladys's birth recorded in Liverpool in June, Florence moved through Battle Crease's nursery and corridors with the quiet authority of a young mother. The sensation of starched muslin against her wrists, the weight of the baby held correctly for presentation to visitors, the sound of bobos, small boots on the wooden floors, these details appear only indirectly in later sources, but the public record is precise. 2 children, a respectable household, a wife fulfilling her expected role. The nursery at Battle Crease occupies the upper floor, a domain overseen by Alice Yap. Here, away from the formal reception rooms, a different routine unfolds. Children in prosperous Victorian households spent most hours with nurses and nursemaids, appearing before parents at scheduled times. Florence's motherhood, like her wifehood, follows scripted patterns. Morning visits to the nursery, afternoon walks with the children properly dressed, evening appearances if guests visit, the emotional labor of motherhood, the midnight wakings, the illnesses, the daily care belongs to hired servants, yet the children are genuinely hers in ways that transcend social performance. Bobo, born in 1882, and Gladys, born in 1886, represent not only fulfilled duty, but human connection in an increasingly isolated life. Letters Florence later writes from prison, strictly limited and censored, will repeatedly ask after her children, express anguish at their forced separation, beg for details of their growth and welfare. Whatever else the marriage has become, the children matter. In the same years, medical receipts and testimonies show James Maybrick consuming arsenic mixtures and patent medicines in quantities that worried some contemporaries only after the fact. The trial testimony reveals an extensive catalog: Fowler's solution, Valentine's meat juice, laced with medicines, various powders and tonics obtained from multiple pharmacies and doctors. Arsenic in this period enjoyed widespread use as a supposed health tonic. Fowler's solution, a potassium arsenite mixture, was prescribed for conditions ranging from skin disorders to malaria. Patent medicines often contained arsenic, cocaine, opium, and other substances later recognized as dangerous. James's medicine habit, documented by several witnesses, included specific behaviors. He carried powders in his pockets, dosing himself throughout the day. He visited multiple doctors, apparently seeking validation for his health concerns or additional prescriptions. he experimented with various pick-me-up tonics, always seeking better vigor, improved digestion, enhanced vitality. The consumption pattern, analyzed decades later, suggests not hypochondria, but genuine illness possibly caused or worsened by the arsenic he consumed, believing it therapeutic. Florence knows the rustle of her husband's medicine cabinet as intimately as the rustle of her own silk skirts. Later, she will write that he was a confirmed invalid in mind and body, governed by his powders. The phrase suggests both compassion and frustration. She nurses him through episodes of illness, accommodates his preoccupation with health, manages household routines around his dosing schedules. Yet his behavior also constrains her life, his anxiety about his health creating an atmosphere of perpetual crisis. Yet in society columns, the couple still appear at races and soirees, the American wife at his side, her gloved hand resting on his arm. The Liverpool papers chronicle their attendance at the Grand National, at local balls, at charity events. Photographs from the period show Florence beautifully dressed, conforming to fashion while displaying the restraint expected of married women. Her appearance is always noted, the quality of her dress, her graceful bearing, her appropriate decoration. Physical beauty, in her world, represents both asset and scrutiny. It validates her success as a society wife, while also marking her as an object of observation and judgment. The contrast is stark. Public images of health and stability, private nights of dosing, anxiety, and growing emotional distance. James's frequent trips to London and elsewhere, ostensibly for business, leave Florence managing the household alone. His financial decisions, which later testimony reveals as increasingly erratic, affect household stability. Bills go unpaid, creditors become pressing, yet the public performance must continue uninterrupted. Florence's own health in these years remains largely undocumented, except where it intersects with public observation. Victorian women's health complaints, nerves, exhaustion, hysteria, often masked genuine suffering or served as acceptable language for expressing distress that had no other outlet. Whether Florence experienced such troubles remains unclear, but the conditions of her life, constant social performance, emotional isolation, constrained agency, financial insecurity masked by public pretense would tax anyone's resilience. While Liverpool reads of their appearances at the Grand National, arsenic bottles and unpaid bills quietly multiply in the background. The material evidence later presented at trial includes dozens of bottles and packets found throughout Battlecrease House after James's death. Arsenic in various forms: flypapers, tonics, medicines, powders. The accumulation testifies both to James's habits and to the casual presence of poison in a respectable Victorian household. Arsenic was everywhere in this period, in wallpaper dyes, in cosmetics, in medicines, in pest control. Its ubiquity would later complicate questions about intent, source, and responsibility. By late 1887, Florence's life followed a disciplined pattern: mornings of nursery visits and correspondence, afternoons of walks along the Aigburth riverfront, evenings at dinners where she must be witty but never too bold. The River Mersey, visible from certain vantage points in Aigburth, serves as both boundary and connection, separating Liverpool's mercantile bustle from suburban domesticity, while reminding residents that their comfort depends on commerce, that their gardens grow on wealth extracted from global cotton trade. In this period, she meets Alfred Brearley, a Liverpool cotton broker and friend of her husband. The introduction likely occurred at one of the social gatherings that punctuated the Liverpool season: a dinner party, a race meeting, a business function where wives accompanied husbands and professional relationships blurred into social ones. Brierley, younger than James, moved in the same commercial circles. The initial acquaintance would have seemed entirely unremarkable, another connection in the network of professional relationships that sustained Liverpool's merchant community. Contemporary accounts and later studies agree that their relationship, begun as sociable companionship, grew into an affair. The exact chronology remains disputed. Some sources suggest the relationship became intimate in 1888, others place it earlier. What is documented is that by early 1889, The connection was known to several people beyond the principals. Florence and Brierly were seen together at the races. They corresponded. At some point, the relationship crossed boundaries that Victorian society marked as absolute for women, if not for men. The double standard governing Victorian sexuality is relevant here. Men's extramarital relationships, while not officially condoned, were widely tolerated as long as discretion prevailed. Women's infidelity, conversely, represented not merely moral failing, but social catastrophe. A woman's sexual fidelity secured patrilineal legitimacy. Any doubt about paternity threatened the fundamental logic of property and inheritance. An unfaithful wife was not simply immoral, but socially destructive, her transgression justifying almost any punishment. The skills she learned as a girl, French phrases, polite laughter, subtle observation, now serve in a different theater. The education designed to make her an attractive wife now helps her navigate an illicit relationship. She knows how to conduct private correspondence that might appear innocent to casual observers. She understands the rhythms of social gatherings well enough to arrange chance encounters that look accidental. The same training in performance that helped her succeed as Mrs. Maybrick of Battlecrease House now serves in constructing a hidden life. Historians of Victorian womanhood have noted that such accomplishments, ostensibly decorative, often masked a sharp awareness of constraint and opportunity. Women like Florence, educated but legally powerless, financially dependent but socially visible, developed sophisticated strategies for navigating impossible situations. Some conformed completely to expectations. Others found ways to carve out spaces of autonomy within oppressive structures. Florence's relationship with Brierly can be read as both moral failing and desperate assertion of choice in a life offering few choices. Florence's surviving letters from this period are lost to us, but the compromising letter, later quoted in court, shows her using her pen to negotiate emotional survival within a collapsing marriage. The letter, written in May 1889 when James lay dying, has been preserved in trial records and extensively analyzed. Its tone combines affection, desperation, and calculation. She describes James as sick unto death while begging Brierly to delay his departure so they might meet again. The phrasing suggests both genuine feeling for Brierly and awareness that James's death might resolve her marital dilemma. In private, her correspondence reaches beyond mere politeness. Yet every letter must still be folded, sealed, and entrusted to servants loyal not to her, but to the household hierarchy. The ritual that once symbolized refinement now carries risk. Victorian households were never truly private. Servants observed, listened, and gossiped. A letter given to a maid for posting passed through hands whose discretion could not be guaranteed. Alice Yap's later betrayal, opening the letter to Brierly and sharing it with James's brothers, was not technically illegal. Servants' loyalty belonged to the household as an institution, not to individual family members whose interests might conflict. The art of letter writing, once a finishing school exercise, has become her only unsupervised voice, and fatally, her most vulnerable one. The same medium that allowed her to perform social competence now exposes her to scrutiny. The careful handwriting, the practiced phrasing, the ability to express emotion within acceptable forms, all these skills become evidence against her when the letter's recipient changes from its intended reader to a hostile audience examining it for proof of guilt. The period from 1887 to early 1889 represents Florence's attempt to create a life bearable despite an unhappy marriage. Whether the relationship with Brierly constituted genuine love, opportunistic strategy, or simple human need for connection and affection, it offered something absent from her marriage to James. And in a world where women had virtually no legal exit from unsatisfactory marriages, the affair represented one of few available forms of rebellion or self-assertion. The cost of discovery, however, would be immeasurably high. On the night of 29 March 1889, after reports of her relationship with Brierly reached him through the efficient gossip networks of Liverpool society, James and Florence quarreled violently at Battlecrease House. Contemporary summaries record that he struck her, leaving a blackened eye visible to servants and visitors in subsequent days, and threatened divorce. The violence marks an escalation, Whether James had previously struck Florence remains unclear from surviving records, but the incident receives documentation precisely because it becomes public knowledge, witnesses later testifying to her visible injuries. In Victorian England, a public divorce would have meant ruin for her reputation and almost certain loss of her children. The law, reformed in 1857 to make divorce somewhat more accessible than previously, still imposed profound asymmetry. A husband could divorce his wife on grounds of adultery alone. A wife seeking divorce had to prove both adultery and an aggravating offense: cruelty, desertion, incest, or other major transgression. Moreover, divorced women lost virtually all parental rights. Custody automatically went to fathers, and mothers might be denied even visiting rights. For Florence, divorce meant losing Bobo and Gladys, losing social standing, losing financial support, and bearing permanent stigma as a fallen woman. The economic reality was equally grim. Florence controlled no independent property. If James divorced her, she would receive neither alimony nor settlement unless he chose to provide them. She would return to her mother or other relatives as a dependent, damaged goods whose presence might taint her family's reputation. Remarriage would be virtually impossible. Employment for women of her class in respectable occupations was extremely limited. Perhaps governess work if she could find a family willing to overlook her history, but even that would be difficult. The threat of divorce was not merely social embarrassment, but potential destitution. In the weeks that follow, several witnesses later testified to small, seemingly domestic acts. In April 1889, Florence purchases flypapers from a local chemist and is seen soaking them in a bowl of water on her dressing table. The purchase and preparation, later described in detail during the trial, seemed unremarkable at the time. Flypapers were common household items purchased from chemists and general stores for basic pest control. Their arsenic content was known but not considered particularly dangerous when used as intended. Arsenic-laced flypapers had recently been publicized in Liverpool during the notorious Black Widows case, where women extracted poison from such sheets to kill relatives for insurance. The case, tried in Liverpool in the mid-1880s, involved multiple women who had murdered family members using arsenic obtained from flypapers. The prosecution demonstrated how the papers could be soaked in water, releasing the arsenic in soluble form, which could then be administered in food or drink. The case received extensive coverage in Liverpool papers, making the method locally famous, or infamous. Whether Florence knew of the Black Widows case remains uncertain, but she lived in Liverpool during its public hearing. The trial would have been difficult to avoid in local society conversations and newspaper reports. Later prosecutors argued that her knowledge of the case demonstrated premeditation. She knew flypapers contained arsenic, knew how to extract it, and knew it could be used to kill. The defense countered that flypapers were so common that their purchase carried no sinister implication, and that other uses for arsenic-soaked water existed. In her later defense, Florence insists that she was preparing a cosmetic wash, a common, if dangerous, practice for maintaining a pale complexion. Arsenic in cosmetics has a long and documented history. Arsenic compounds, applied topically or ingested in tiny doses, were believed to improve skin appearance, creating the fashionably pale complexion that Victorian standards of beauty demanded. Numerous beauty manuals and periodicals mentioned arsenic washes, though they also warned of potential dangers. The practice was sufficiently widespread that Florence's explanation, while self-serving, was not implausible. The bowl of water, the paper softening at the edges, the faint chemical tang in a quiet bedroom, these are the ordinary details that, under forensic scrutiny, become ominous. Alice Yap testified that she observed Florence with the bowl and the papers, noting the behavior because it seemed unusual but not initially alarming. Only later, after James's death and the inquest, did the memory acquire sinister significance. The transformation of ordinary domestic action into evidence of murderous intent would become a pattern throughout the case. Here, the curriculum of womanly self-care intersects with a culture newly obsessed with toxicology. Victorian science had made enormous strides in detecting poisons, and the popular press covered poisoning cases with sensational detail. The development of reliable chemical tests for arsenic, particularly the Marsh and Reinsch tests, meant that poisoning could be detected and proved in ways impossible in earlier generations. This forensic capability coincided with widespread public anxiety about domestic poisoning, particularly by women who had ready access to household poisons and the privacy to administer them unobserved. The same substances sold to soothe or beautify could, in the wrong narrative, be recast as instruments of murder. The ambiguity of arsenic, simultaneously cure, cosmetic, and poison, reflected larger ambiguities about Victorian women, whose domestic roles combined nurturance and danger, whose access to household substances meant they could heal or harm. The figure of the poisoner, particularly the female poisoner, haunted Victorian imagination precisely because it inverted the domestic ideal. The angel in the house becomes the angel of death. The nurturing wife becomes the murdering spouse. Medicine becomes murder. When a woman's beauty routine uses arsenic, how easily can a face wash be reread as a first attempt at poisoning? The question would hang over Florence's trial, unanswerable but decisive. In a legal system requiring proof beyond reasonable doubt, the prosecution successfully argued that doubt itself should resolve against her, that her possession of arsenic, her knowledge of its effects, her motive in an unhappy marriage, and her demonstrated capacity for deception in the affair with Brierly all combined to make murder the most plausible explanation for events. On 8 May 1889, with James gravely ill after a series of self-administered tonics and a doctor's diagnosis of acute dyspepsia, Florence sat at a small table in Battlecrease House, the sick room just down the corridor. The curtains are half drawn against the spring afternoon light. Nurses move softly through the upper rooms, glass bottles clink on trays, and the household has settled into the tense quiet that attends serious illness. James has been sick for days, vomiting repeatedly, unable to keep food down, weakening visibly. Several doctors have been called, their diagnoses varying, their treatments ineffective. She takes out paper and in the same tidy hand trained in Stuttgart, writes to Alfred Brierly. The physical act of writing continues the practice of decades. The selection of paper, the preparation of ink, the careful formation of letters that must convey feeling while maintaining enough composure to be legible. But the content of this letter breaks from social convention. This is not a thank you note or a polite invitation, but a desperate communication to a lover, written while her husband lies possibly dying in the next room. The letter, later summarized in both trial literature and modern scholarship, describes her husband as sick unto death and insists he is perfectly ignorant of everything, lines that prosecutors would underline as evidence of duplicity. The phrase sick unto death echoes biblical language, suggesting grave illness without explicitly predicting fatal outcome. The claim that James is perfectly ignorant refers in context to his lack of knowledge about her relationship with Brierly, an assertion meant to reassure Brierly that James does not suspect him. But in court, the phrase would be read as evidence that Florence was concealing something criminal, that she was actively deceiving her dying husband. Florence begs Brierly to delay an overseas business trip until she can see him again. Brierly had planned to travel to Constantinople on business, a journey that would take him away for weeks or months. The letter expresses Florence's desperate desire for his presence, her need for emotional support during what she presents as a crisis. Some historians have read the letter as evidence of genuine love, others as calculation by a woman who saw her husband's death as potential liberation and wanted to secure her relationship with Brierly before and after the anticipated death. Entrusting the note to Alice Yap to post, she follows an old ritual: fold, seal, dispatch. The gesture, repeated countless times in her life, has become automatic. A letter written, folded, sealed, given to a servant for posting. This is how correspondence works in a world without telephones, without instant communication, where written words travel slowly through the postal system, and privacy depends on trust and servants' discretion. But Yap, who by several accounts dislikes her mistress, claims the envelope was dropped in a puddle by little Gladys, opens it, reads, and passes it to Edwin Maybrick, then to Michael Maybrick, the influential brother who already suspects Florence. The sequence of events, as later testified, remains slightly uncertain. Yap claimed she noticed the envelope was wet and, fearing the ink might run, opened it to see if the letter was readable. She then showed it to Edwin Maybrick, one of James's brothers, who immediately showed it to Michael. Michael Maybrick, a successful composer and singer who performed under the name Stephen Adams, wielded considerable influence in the family. He had never particularly liked Florence, viewing her as an extravagant American who spent money carelessly and did not properly appreciate English ways. The letter confirmed his worst suspicions, providing apparent proof that Florence had a lover and was already thinking beyond James's life. At that moment, a private document becomes Crown evidence, a gesture of desperation filtered through class resentment and family hostility, is reclassified as proof of murderous intent. The transformation of the letter from personal correspondence to legal exhibit reveals much about the power dynamics operating within the household. Florence had written the letter believing she controlled its circulation, that it would go directly from Yap to the post office to Briarly, a private communication between lovers. But servants' loyalty, as previously noted, belonged to the household institution, not to individual family members. Yap's decision to open and share the letter, while a breach of Florence's trust, was not illegal and probably seemed to apt a proper defense of household interests against a mistress whose behavior threatened the family's reputation. The letter's content, moreover, could be read multiple ways. Florence's defenders later argued that it showed only a woman seeking emotional support from a friend during her husband's illness. Nothing in the letter explicitly discusses poison or murder. The language, while indicating intimacy with Briarly, could be interpreted as panicked correspondence during a medical crisis rather than evidence of murderous planning. But in the context of James's death 3 days later, and the subsequent inquest revealing arsenic in his body, the letter acquired retrospective significance as apparent proof of motive and guilty consciousness. The letter meant to save her. One ally will instead stand beside arsenic bottles as the most damaging exhibit against her. During the trial, the letter was read aloud in court, printed in newspapers, discussed in editorials and pamphlets. Its phrasing was analyzed for hidden meanings, its timing interpreted as evidence of premeditation, its very existence presented as proof that Florence had both motive and opportunity to kill her husband. What had been written as a private plea became a public spectacle. Florence's emotional vulnerability transformed into legal liability. The moment crystallizes a recurring theme in Florence's story: the transformation of private expression into public evidence, the reinterpretation of personal documents through hostile lenses, the exposure of intimate life to forensic scrutiny. The skills she had learned, refined correspondence, elegant phrasing, emotional articulation within social conventions, all became liabilities when the audience changed from the intended recipient to a jury evaluating her guilt. The letter, like so much else in her life, was taken from her control and used against her, her own words weaponized by others who held the power to interpret and judge. On the night of 90 May 1889, in the shaded bedroom of Battle Crease House, the air smelled of medicine and coal. A nurse, hired to tend James Maybrick during his final illness, watches as Florence lifts a small bottle of Valentine's meat juice from the bedside table and carries it into the adjoining washroom. The nurse, whose testimony would later prove crucial, observes this action with suspicion. The household atmosphere has become charged with mistrust. Michael and Edwin Maybrick have been in the house since discovering Florence's letter, and their presence has transformed the sick room into something approaching a surveillance operation. Valentine's meat juice was a popular Victorian dietary supplement, a concentrated beef extract marketed as particularly suitable for invalids who could not tolerate solid food. The bottle, usually a few ounces, contained dark, viscous liquid meant to be mixed with water or other beverages. It was precisely the sort of thing a wife might naturally administer to a sick husband, part of the routine care of illness. But in the context of suspicion about poisoning, even ordinary nursing actions acquired sinister potential. Later, toxicological reports confirmed that the bottle contains about half a grain of arsenic. Not, according to some experts, a fatal dose in itself, but enough to fuel suspicion. The amount of arsenic detected, approximately 0.03 grams, represented a quantity that might cause gastrointestinal distress but would likely not kill a man habituated to arsenic consumption, as James apparently was. Expert testimony at trial divided on this point. Some experts argued that in a man who regularly consumed arsenic-laced tonics, tolerance might make even this dose non-lethal. Others countered that any addition of arsenic to an invalid's food represented attempted murder, regardless of whether the dose was immediately fatal. Florence will later testify that James, long habituated to tonics, begged her to add one of his own pick-me-up powders to the meat essence. Her account, presented through her defense attorneys and later in her memoir, describes James as insistent despite medical advice against self-medication. He had been taking various powders and tonics throughout his illness, convinced that his doctors did not understand his constitution as well as he did himself. Florence, in this version, was following her husband's explicit instructions, providing him with medicine he demanded, acting as a dutiful wife rather than a poisoner. The soundscape is small but telling: the clink of glass, the soft protest of the nurse, the ticking of a mantel clock while relatives whisper outside the door. The nurse's objection, recorded in her testimony, was not sufficiently forceful to prevent Florence's action, but enough to document it. The Maybrick brothers, positioned elsewhere in the house, were informed almost immediately. The surveillance, though not complete, was sufficient to ensure that Florence's movements were observed and recorded, creating a documentary record that would later serve as evidence. In family memoirs and later histories, this night becomes a hinge, the point at which ordinary caregiving is reinterpreted as attempted murder. The transformation depends entirely on perspective. Seen one way, Florence is a wife trying to comfort a difficult patient who insists on remedies against medical advice. Seen another way, she is a poisoner seizing opportunity to administer one more dose to a victim already weakened by previous administrations. The facts, Florence taking the bottle, adding something to it, returning it, admit both interpretations. The choice between them depends on prior assumptions about her guilt or innocence. When James died on 11 May 1889, at 8:40 p.m. by one account, his brothers immediately demanded an inquest and examination for poison. Their response was swift and decisive. Within hours of James's death, Michael Maybrick had contacted authorities, demanded that the body not be released for burial, and called for autopsy and toxicological analysis. His certainty of foul play, based largely on the compromising letter and the nurse's reports of suspicious behavior, drove the investigation from the beginning. Their mistrust of Florence, as American, as spendthrift, as an adulterous wife, shapes the narrative from the first official statement. The Liverpool press, receiving information from the Maybrick brothers and their allies, began constructing a story of the murdering wife even before the inquest formally opened. Florence's nationality, her relationship with Brierly, her supposed extravagance with household money, all these factors became part of the public story, creating a context in which evidence of poisoning would be read as confirmation of what was already suspected, rather than as neutral facts requiring interpretation. The question of James's arsenic habituation would become central to the case, but would never be definitively resolved. On one hand, substantial evidence showed he regularly consumed arsenic-containing preparations. Multiple witnesses testified to his medicine habit. Bottles and powders found in his possession contained arsenic. His own statements to friends and colleagues suggested he believed arsenic was beneficial for his health. Some experts argued that his symptoms during the final illness were consistent with acute arsenic poisoning superimposed on chronic consumption. That is, that he died from an additional dose administered by someone else, even though he had been taking smaller doses for years. On the other hand, the autopsy and toxicological analysis revealed only small amounts of arsenic in his organs, far less than would typically be expected if he had been poisoned with intent to kill. The arsenic detected could plausibly be explained by his own consumption patterns. No single fatal dose was ever proven. The medical evidence, complex and contested, admitted multiple interpretations. Yet, in the context of moral suspicion, ambiguous evidence tended to resolve against Florence. Within 24 hours, the quiet act of preparing a tonic is recast as an assault, and the sick room becomes a crime scene. The Maybrick brothers took control of Battlecrease House, restricting Florence's movements, searching her rooms, inventorying household possessions, and gathering evidence. Florence, now a suspect rather than a widow, found herself effectively imprisoned in her own home, her privacy eliminated, her possessions confiscated, her every action observed and recorded. The domestic space where she had performed the role of wife and mother for 8 years transformed into a site of criminal investigation. Every bottle and paper potentially evidence, every room potentially hiding proof of guilt. By 18th of May, 1889, an inquest opened in a nearby egg birth hotel, a practice common when respectable homes are deemed too intimate for public proceedings. The venue, probably the egg birth hotel or a similar establishment, provided neutral ground where witnesses could testify and jurors deliberate without the taint of association with either the deceased or the accused. The room, furnished with tables and chairs brought in for the occasion, smells of tobacco and damp wool. Outside, townspeople gather to read chalked headlines about the American wife, suspected of poisoning her husband with arsenic from flypaper. The inquest format, a peculiarity of English law, served as a preliminary investigation into suspicious deaths. A coroner, usually a lawyer or doctor, presided over a jury of local men who would hear evidence and render a verdict on cause of death. If they found evidence of murder, the inquest could commit the accused for trial. The proceedings were quasi-legal, less formal than a trial, but with significant legal consequences. Witnesses testified under oath, but without the full procedural protections of criminal trial. The accused could attend, but had limited rights to challenge evidence or cross-examine witnesses. Medical witnesses report slight traces of arsenic in James's organs, enough to alarm, too little to conclusively kill. Dr. Charles Tidy, a prominent toxicologist called to analyze the samples, found arsenic in the liver, kidneys, and intestines, but in quantities he initially described as small or very small. The exact amounts, reported with some variation in different sources, were measured in fractions of a grain. Dr. Tidy's analysis, while detecting poison, did not find the large concentrations typically associated with acute fatal poisoning. His testimony admitted that the amounts detected could be consistent with either deliberate poisoning in small doses over time or with the deceased's own consumption of arsenic-containing medicines. Other medical witnesses testified to James's symptoms during his final illness: vomiting, diarrhea, abdominal pain, weakness. Symptoms consistent with arsenic poisoning, but also consistent with various other conditions, including the acute dyspepsia initially diagnosed. Victorian medicine, lacking modern diagnostic tools, often relied on symptom patterns that could indicate multiple conditions. The retrospective diagnosis of poisoning depended heavily on finding arsenic in the body. Without toxicological evidence, James's death might have been attributed to natural causes. The inquest, shaped by Victorian fascination with toxicology, leans heavily on bottles, powders, and chemical tests. Yet social evidence slips in at every turn. Her visits to Brierley, her purchases at the chemist, her extravagant tastes noted in family commentary. The Maybrick brothers and their allies presented Florence's character as evidence alongside chemical findings. Testimony about her relationship with Brierley, though not directly relevant to whether James died of poison, created a context suggesting motive. References to household debt and Florence's spending, though James controlled the finances and bore responsibility for the debts, suggested she might murder for money. The mingling of chemical evidence and moral judgment established a pattern that would continue through the trial. Alice Yap's testimony about the compromising letter received particular attention. The letter, read aloud, shocked the inquest attendees. In Victorian moral terms, the letter proved Florence's adultery and therefore her capacity for deception and betrayal. If she could betray her marriage vows, the logic ran, she could also commit murder. The conflation of sexual transgression with criminal violence, though legally and logically dubious, carried enormous emotional weight for contemporary audiences. The purchase of flypapers, documented by the chemist who sold them, became crucial evidence. The chemist testified that Florence bought arsenic-laced flypapers in April, just weeks before James's illness and death. Under questioning, he confirmed that such papers could be soaked to extract arsenic in liquid form. The prosecution theory, clear though not yet formally stated, was that Florence had extracted arsenic from the papers and administered it to James over time, causing his death. Her claim that she intended to use the arsenic for cosmetic purposes was noted but treated skeptically. In the pamphlet Is Mrs. Maybrick Guilty? And in J.H. Levy's later tract on criminal appeals, critics would argue that from the very first proceedings, moral judgment about Florence's adultery contaminated legal reasoning. Levy, a prominent advocate for criminal justice reform, published extensively about the case, arguing that Florence had been convicted based on circumstantial evidence and moral prejudice, rather than proof beyond reasonable doubt. His analysis, published in the years following the trial, identified the inquest as the point where bias became embedded in the official narrative, making a fair trial increasingly difficult. The inquest concludes with a murder charge and transfer to Walton Jail, the first step in a process that will transform a domestic tragedy into a national spectacle. The jury's verdict, delivered after several days of testimony, concluded that James Maybrick had died from arsenic poisoning and that Florence Maybrick had administered the poison. The finding committed her for trial at the Liverpool Assizes, effectively determining that a criminal trial would proceed. The woman once taught to speak only in carefully modulated social phrases now finds her every recorded word, letters, statements, even silences, reinterpreted by others. Florence's limited testimony at the inquest, given under difficult circumstances and without full legal representation, would be used against her at trial. Her attempts to explain her actions, the flypapers for cosmetics, the medicine for James at his own request, sounded defensive. Her silences on certain topics were interpreted as guilty concealment. The interpretive framework, established at the inquest and refined at trial, left her little room to present an alternative narrative. When a marriage becomes an inquest, every gesture of care or desire is relabeled in the ledger. Motive, opportunity, guilt. The transformation of domestic life into crime scene, of nursing into poisoning, of private letters into public evidence, exemplifies how thoroughly Florence's life had been taken from her control and submitted to public judgment. The mechanisms that should have protected her, the law, social status, respectable appearance, instead became tools for her prosecution. On 31st July 1889, crowds filled St. George's Hall, Liverpool, an immense neoclassical building whose Corinthian columns and coffered ceilings were meant to glorify civic power. Today, they frame the trial of Florence Maybrick. St. George's Hall, completed in 1854, ranks among Victorian England's most impressive public buildings. Its design deliberately evokes ancient temples of justice, suggesting through architecture the weight and majesty of law. The Great Hall, with its vast organ and elaborate floor mosaics, normally hosted concerts and civic ceremonies. The crown courts within the building provided suitably imposing settings for major criminal trials. The crowd that gathers for Florence's trial reflects intense public interest. Newspaper coverage had been extensive and sensational. The story combined elements guaranteed to fascinate Victorian audiences: a beautiful woman, a wealthy household, arsenic, adultery, and mysterious death. The press gallery is filled with reporters from London and provincial papers. Spectators queue for limited public seating, hoping to witness the drama firsthand. Outside the hall, crowds gather to read bulletins posted as testimony proceeds. Presiding is Mr. Justice James Fitzjames Stephen, a judge whose career included significant contributions to criminal law reform, but who, at 60, was showing signs of the mental decline that would force his retirement 3 years later. Stephen, a formidable legal intellect, held conservative views on women's roles and moral behavior. His writings and earlier judgments revealed a man who believed strongly in moral absolutes and who viewed women's sexual transgression as particularly serious. His appointment to preside over Florence's trial would prove consequential. Prosecuting for the Crown is John Addison, Q.C., supported by other barristers. The prosecution case, as it unfolds over several days, emphasizes three main points. Florence had motive, an unhappy marriage and a lover, opportunity, access to arsenic and to James during his illness, and suspicious behavior. The flypapers, the meat juice incident, the compromising letter. The prosecution narrative presents Florence as a cold, calculating poisoner who murdered her husband to free herself to marry her lover, or possibly to gain financially from his death. Defending Florence are Sir Charles Russell Q.C., later Lord Russell of Culloden, and other counsel. Russell, one of the most distinguished advocates of the era, would later serve as Lord Chief Justice. His defense strategy emphasized the weakness of medical evidence, the small amount of arsenic found, the lack of proof that Florence administered it, James's habit of self-medicating with arsenic, and alternative explanations for all the suspicious circumstances. The defense faced significant challenges, however, not least that Florence's adultery was undeniable and damaging to her credibility. The indictment focuses on arsenic and intent, but the judge's summing up, as legal historians have emphasized, dwells at length on Florence's adultery with Alfred Brierly, presenting her moral lapse as evidence of capacity for murder. Stephen's charge to the jury, delivered at the trial's conclusion, has been extensively criticized for this conflation. He spent considerable time describing Florence's adultery in harsh terms, calling it evidence of a horrible, incredible intrigue that showed her capable of deception and wickedness. While this characterization reflected Victorian moral standards, it improperly suggested that sexual transgression proved criminal guilt. Modern legal analysis recognizes that Stephen's charge was seriously flawed. The issue before the jury was whether Florence had murdered her husband, not whether she had committed adultery. Adultery might provide motive, but moral judgment about her sexual behavior should not have influenced assessment of whether the prosecution had proved murder beyond reasonable doubt. Stephen's charge, however, encouraged the jury to view Florence's character as the central issue rather than the ambiguous medical evidence and circumstantial case. In the press gallery, reporters sketch her, pale, composed, exquisitely dressed even in the dock, the finishing school lessons in posture and restraint now serving to make her legible as both lady and possible poisoner. Contemporary accounts consistently remark on Florence's appearance and demeanor throughout the trial. She is described as beautiful, well-dressed, calm, sometimes tearful but generally controlled. Her composure is noted approvingly by some observers, suggesting innocence and breeding, and disapprovingly by others, suggesting cold calculation and lack of proper feeling. The attention to her appearance reflects Victorian assumptions about women and emotion. A truly innocent woman might be expected to show visible distress, to break down, to display suffering that proved her victimization. Florence's relative composure could be read as suspicious, as evidence that she lacked proper feeling or was confident in her deception, yet any display of strong emotion might equally be interpreted as theatrical performance, calculated to manipulate sympathy. The double bind left her few options for self-presentation. The compromising letter is read aloud. The words, "sick unto death," echo under the vaulted roof. The letter's public reading, in the formal setting of the courtroom, and reported in newspapers, represents the ultimate violation of Florence's privacy. The desperate communication to a lover, never intended for public consumption, becomes a spectacle. Her words are analyzed, dissected, interpreted as evidence against her. The intimacy she sought to preserve through careful writing becomes public knowledge, her private feelings exposed to the moral judgment of strangers. On 7 August 1889, the jury returned a verdict of guilty after about 35 minutes. The speed of deliberation suggests that the jury found the case straightforward, despite the complexity of medical evidence and the circumstantial nature of much proof. Various factors likely influenced the verdict. Florence's adultery, the appearance of suspicious behavior around the fly papers and meat juice, the compromising letter, and Stephen's charge to the jury emphasizing moral character over reasonable doubt about medical facts. Justice Stephen dons the black cap and pronounces the death sentence as required by law for murder convictions. The sentence shocks even those who believe Florence guilty. Many observers expected the jury might return a manslaughter verdict or, if finding murder, might recommend mercy. The death sentence for a woman of Florence's class was unusual, execution even more so. The spectacle of a young, beautiful, educated woman being sentenced to hang disturbed Victorian sensibilities, even among those who believed her guilty. Letters to the editor and pamphlets like, "Is Mrs. Maybrick guilty?" and the necessity for criminal appeal quickly protested that she cannot be condemned on such evidence, framing the case as a miscarriage of justice and a warning about courts that conflate morality with proof. Public reaction divided sharply. Many believed Florence guilty and the verdict just, but a significant movement immediately organized to protest the conviction, arguing that the evidence was insufficient, the trial unfair, and the verdict influenced by prejudice rather than proof. The courtroom, meant to weigh facts, has also judged a style of womanhood. As the sentence is read, the same graceful stillness once praised in society columns is reinterpreted as the composure of a murderer. Florence's education, designed to make her an asset in the marriage market, has instead become a liability. Her refinement suggests calculation, her beauty suggests dangerous sexuality, her letters suggest duplicity. Every accomplishment turns against her in a legal proceeding that judges not merely her actions, but her entire life. After public outcry and internal review, Home Secretary Henry Matthews and Lord Chancellor Halsbury advised that, while Florence likely administered arsenic, there is reasonable doubt it caused James's death. Her sentence was commuted to life imprisonment in late August 1889. The commutation followed intense public pressure and behind-the-scenes legal review. Petitions bearing thousands of signatures were presented to the Home Office. Medical experts wrote letters questioning the toxicological evidence. American officials, responding to pressure from U.S. citizens concerned about Florence's treatment, made diplomatic inquiries about the case. Matthews, reviewing the case file and consulting legal advisors, concluded that the medical evidence was too weak to support the death sentence. While the jury had convicted and judges were reluctant to overturn jury verdicts, the Home Secretary possessed power to commute sentences in cases where execution seemed unjust. Matthews' decision to commute rather than pardon reflected a compromise, acknowledging doubt while not overturning the conviction. The formula, that Florence likely administered arsenic but reasonable doubt existed about causation of death, allowed the government to spare her life while maintaining that the trial verdict was not wholly wrong. The distinction was crucial. A pardon would have declared Florence innocent and acknowledged a miscarriage of justice. Commutation merely changed the sentence while leaving the conviction intact. Florence remained legally guilty of murder. She simply would not be executed for it. The status left her in legal limbo, neither clearly guilty nor definitively innocent, neither executed nor exonerated. From 1890, Florence entered Woking Female Convict Prison, then transferred to Aylesbury. Prison in 1896 under the brutal silent system, enforced silence, solitary confinement, and regulated labor. Victorian prison reform, influenced by both religious ideas about penitence and modern theories about discipline, had created systems intended to transform criminals through isolation and reflection. The silent system, implemented in many British prisons, prohibited prisoners from speaking to one another, required solitary confinement for much of the day, and imposed mind-numbing routine labor. In her memoir, My 15 Lost Years, Florence describes solitary as by far the most cruel feature of English penal servitude, recounting nights broken by the shrieks of other inmates and days of scrubbing pots, tables, and floors until her nerves quivered. Her account, published in 1904 after her release, provides detailed descriptions of prison conditions. She describes the cell's dimensions, the limited diet, the harsh discipline for minor infractions, the monotony of repetitive labor, and the psychological strain of enforced silence and isolation. The memoir also documents the treatment of women prisoners, who in this period were subjected to particularly harsh conditions. Victorian ideology that elevated women as moral guardians of society treated women criminals as especially fallen, deserving of punishment that would break their willful spirit and reconstruct them as properly submissive. Florence's status as a middle-class woman convicted of poisoning her husband made her particularly subject to this ideology. Prison officials saw their task as breaking her pride and refinement, reducing her to proper penitence through harsh routine. Here, the motif of letters returns in reduced form. Prison rules allow limited correspondence. Stark supervised notes to her children and relatives, each line examined, censored, and filed. Victorian prisons severely restricted communication with the outside world. Letters had to be earned through good behavior, were limited in number, were written on prison stationery, and were read by prison staff before being sent. Any content deemed inappropriate could result in the letter being withheld and the prisoner punished. For Florence, the restriction was particularly painful. Her children, Bobo and Gladys, were being raised by the Maybrick family in England, and she had limited information about their welfare and no direct contact. Her mother, who worked for years to secure Florence's release, could communicate only through these restricted channels. The letters Florence wrote from prison, preserved in some collections, show careful, restrained language, limited content, and obvious awareness of official surveillance. The spontaneity and emotional expression of her earlier correspondence disappeared under the weight of institutional control. Campaigners outside, among them members of the Women's International Maybrick Society and reformers arguing for a court of criminal appeal, circulate petitions, pamphlets, and open letters bearing her name as a symbol of systemic injustice. The campaign for Florence's release, sustained over more than a decade, involved multiple organizations and prominent individuals. The Women's International Maybrick Society, founded specifically to advocate for her, organized petitions, fundraised for legal expenses, and kept the case in public view through newsletters and public meetings. The campaign also connected to broader reform movements. Advocates for a court of criminal appeal, which did not exist in England until 1907, pointed to Florence's case as evidence that the system needed a mechanism to correct trial errors. Her case exemplified how someone convicted on weak evidence had no legal recourse once appeals to the Home Secretary failed. The only remedy was executive clemency, a political rather than legal process, which left justice dependent on public pressure and political calculations rather than systematic review. While her earlier letters express private emotions within a framework of etiquette, these new documents are public artifacts, tools in a battle about law, gender, and authority. The campaign pamphlets and petitions bearing Florence's name transformed her from a private individual into a public symbol. She represented wronged womanhood, the victim of sexual double standards, the casualty of judicial prejudice. Campaigners used her story to argue for women's rights, legal reform, and more humane prison conditions. Yet within her cell, Florence's own voice remains constrained to narrow blue lines on prison stationery. The irony is sharp. She has become famous, her case discussed internationally, her name appearing in newspapers and reform literature, yet she herself has almost no voice in these discussions. Others speak for her, interpret her experience, use her story for their own purposes. Her actual agency, her ability to speak in her own voice remains minimal. The experience of imprisonment, extending from 1889 to 1904, constituted more than a decade of Florence's life, from age 27 to 41, years that might otherwise have been spent raising her children, pursuing interests, building a life. Instead, those years were lost to institutional routine, isolation, and deprivation. The title of her memoir, My 15 Lost Years, captures this sense of time stolen, life interrupted, possibility foreclosed by forces beyond her control. The woman once trained to write flowery notes of thanks now composes rigid, inspected letters that double as evidence in a larger argument about justice. The transformation represents yet another reinterpretation of her writing, another instance of her words being taken from her control and used for purposes she cannot direct. The letters that once performed social competence, then exposed her to prosecution, now serve as exhibits in a campaign for criminal justice reform. Always written by Florence, but never quite belonging to her. Always expressing her experience, but always filtered through others' interpretive frameworks. In January 1904, after more than 14 years in confinement, Florence was released and returned to the United States, her citizenship restored. The release followed sustained pressure from multiple sources: American diplomatic efforts, organized campaigns, petitions to successive Home Secretaries, and persistent advocacy by her mother and various reform organizations gradually wore down official resistance. The decision to release her was presented as an act of mercy rather than an acknowledgement of innocence. Florence remained a convicted murderer whose sentence had been reduced to time served. She spends a period at a convent in Cornwall, then travels to France to see her mother before landing in New York. The transition to freedom was difficult. After 14 years of institutional routine, the ordinary tasks of daily life required relearning. Florence, now 41, faced a world changed from the one she had left in 1889. The Victorian age was ending. Edwardian society had different rhythms and concerns. Technologies like telephones and early automobiles were becoming common. The social networks she once navigated no longer existed for her. Her notoriety made anonymity impossible. Her poverty made social rehabilitation difficult. Her mother, now elderly, had spent much of her wealth and energy on the campaign for Florence's release. The resources that might have supported Florence's reintegration into society had been consumed by legal fees, pamphlets, travel, and political lobbying. The Chandler family's standing in mobile society had been strained by scandal. European connections had faded. Florence, once positioned to marry into prosperity, now faced middle age with no independent income, limited employment prospects, and permanent stigma. Lecture announcements in American newspapers list her under her married name, inviting audiences to hear a woman wrongfully condemned speak on prison reform. The lecture tour represented both opportunity and exploitation. Americans interested in sensational crime, British justice, and women's rights would pay to hear Florence tell her story. The lectures provided income and kept her case in public view. Yet they also required her to repeatedly perform her trauma, to present herself as victim and survivor for audiences seeking entertainment as much as enlightenment. Contemporary newspaper coverage of the lectures shows mixed reactions. Some audiences were sympathetic, moved by Florence's accounts of prison conditions and convinced of her innocence. Others remained skeptical, viewing the lectures as a convicted murderer's attempt to rehabilitate her reputation and profit from notoriety. The lectures themselves, like so much of Florence's life, became subject to competing interpretations, the same facts supporting opposite conclusions depending on the observer's prior assumptions. That same year, she published Mrs. Maybrick's Own Story, My 15 Lost Years, a memoir that folds court records, personal suffering, and appeals to public conscience into one text. The memoir, published by Funk and Wagnalls, combines multiple genres: autobiography, prison exposé, legal argument, and vindication narrative. Florence narrates her life from childhood through imprisonment to release, presenting her version of events and challenging the prosecution narrative that convicted her. On its pages, she writes not in the language of drawing rooms, but in the measured tone of someone insisting on her version of events in the face of official narratives. The style differs markedly from her earlier correspondence. Gone are the social niceties, the decorative phrases, the careful modulation designed to please readers. Instead, the memoir adopts a tone of restrained indignation, asserting innocence while documenting injustice. She describes her trial as unfair, emphasizes the weakness of medical evidence, explains her actions in terms that assert innocence and reasonable behavior. The memoir also serves reformist purposes, documenting prison conditions in ways that support arguments for penal reform. Florence describes the silent system, the inadequate diet, the harsh discipline, The psychological damage of prolonged isolation, her status as a middle-class woman, educated and articulate, made her accounts particularly valuable to reformers who could present her as a credible witness to conditions that working-class prisoners had been describing for years without being heard. In later years, under her maiden name Florence Elizabeth Chandler, she lived in modest circumstances in Gaylordsville, Connecticut, described by neighbors as a recluse in a small, shabby bungalow surrounded by cats. The trajectory from Battlecrease House to a Connecticut bungalow measures the distance she had fallen. Gaylordsville, a rural community in northwestern Connecticut, offered obscurity but little else. The bungalow, described in various sources as poorly maintained, reflected limited resources. The cats, mentioned in multiple accounts, provided companionship for a woman whose human connections had been largely severed. Neighbors recalled her as solitary, occasionally seen in the small town but not socially active. Some knew her identity, others learned it only after her death. She lived quietly, apparently supported by small amounts from lecture earnings, possible family assistance, and her own frugality. The contrast with her earlier life, the Stuttgart education, the Atlantic crossing, the Liverpool drawing rooms, could hardly be more complete. When she died on 23 October 1941, obituaries note that among her few possessions were a family Bible and a scrapbook of yellowed clippings from the 1889 trial and its aftermath. The obituaries, appearing in both American and British papers, revived the case briefly. Some recalled her as a victim of injustice, others as a convicted murderer who never admitted guilt. The persistence of contradictory narratives, even in death, testified to the case's enduring ambiguity. The scrapbook, mentioned in several obituaries and estate accounts, contained newspaper clippings, pamphlets, letters, and other documents related to her case. She had collected and preserved the public record of her trial and imprisonment, creating an archive of her own victimization or guilt, depending on interpretation. The act of keeping the scrapbook suggests Florence's ongoing engagement with her own story, her need to document and preserve evidence of what had happened to her, even though, or perhaps because, the documentation could never definitively prove her innocence. The girl who once wrote polished thank you notes on embossed stationery now leaves behind brittle newsprint, other people's words about her, carefully pasted into place by her own hand. The final irony: Florence's archive consists not of her own words but of others' accounts of her. The letters she wrote, the diary she kept, the personal documents that might have preserved her authentic voice, these were largely lost or destroyed. What survived were trial transcripts, newspaper reports, campaign pamphlets, memoir written under pressure to vindicate herself. Always Florence's story, but always mediated through institutional and public demands. In the end, her archive is not a jewel box or deed chest, but a worn scrapbook, its fading paste holding together the fragments of a life reshaped by accusation. The scrapbook stands as material evidence of how thoroughly Florence's life had been taken from her control, rewritten by others, preserved in forms that she could collect but not author. The elegant hand trained in Stuttgart ends its work pasting newspaper clippings, the final performance of a life spent negotiating between self-expression and social surveillance, between authentic voice and imposed narrative. In a climate-controlled archive today, a researcher turns the page of an old pamphlet or unfolds a fragile letter signed Florence E. Maybrick. The ink has browned, the paper thinned at the folds where fingers once smoothed it flat. Somewhere else, the photograph of a young woman in late Victorian dress, gloved, poised, eyes slightly averted, is catalogued not under society but notable trials. The ritual gesture that threaded her life, the act of writing, folding, and offering a letter, has been frozen in time as evidence of guilt or innocence, of double standards, of an era's faith in both chemistry and morality as tools of judgment. The documents preserved in archives across 3 continents tell competing stories. Trial transcripts present Florence as a calculating poisoner. Campaign pamphlets portray her as an innocent victim. Prison records document her as a disciplinary problem or model prisoner, depending on which reports one reads. Her own memoir insists on innocence while acknowledging mistakes. The historical record, like the trial evidence, admits multiple interpretations, each supported by carefully selected facts, each challenged by inconvenient contradictions. Modern forensic analysis, attempted decades later by historians and scientists, cannot resolve the questions that Victorian toxicology could not answer. Was James Maybrick killed by arsenic deliberately administered, or did he die from the cumulative effects of his own poisoning habit? Did Florence extract arsenic from fly papers with intent to kill? Or did she truly use it for cosmetic purposes? Did she add arsenic to his meat juice, or only the pick-me-up powders he requested? The physical evidence, long since dispersed or degraded, cannot now be reanalyzed with modern techniques. All that remains are the documents, testimony, analysis, argument, interpretation. The story that began with a girl copying polite phrases in a European schoolroom ends with a few surviving scraps of paper and a quiet grave in Connecticut, far from Mobile and Liverpool. The arc of Florence's life, from privileged education to transatlantic marriage to public trial to long imprisonment to obscure death, traces patterns larger than individual biography. Her story illuminates the mechanisms through which Victorian society controlled women, through law that made wives legal dependents of husbands, through moral codes that judged women's sexuality far more harshly than men's, through social structures that offered women visibility but little power, through educational systems that trained girls to perform elegance while suppressing authentic self-expression. The gloves she once pulled tight before entering St. George's Hall are gone. The letters remain, not as her voice alone, but as mirrors, reflecting how a world eager to punish or romanticize women of her class chose to read them. Some letters survive in court records, preserved as evidence. Others exist in quoted fragments in newspaper accounts or campaign literature. A few, held in private collections or institutional archives, wait for researchers who may discover them and offer new interpretations. But always the letters exist as public documents, subject to reading and rereading, their meaning never stable, their author never fully in control of what her words come to signify. The elegance that was supposed to protect Florence, the refined education, the practiced grace, the social competence, instead made her vulnerable. Her beauty attracted attention that became scrutiny. Her accomplishment suggested a capacity for deception. Her letters demonstrated skill in written expression that prosecutors reframed as skill in manipulation. Every asset became a liability when social position collapsed and hostility replaced goodwill. The case of Florence Maybrick, more than a century after the trial, continues to generate debate among historians, criminologists, legal scholars, and true crime enthusiasts. Books, articles, websites, and even a biographical novel have presented competing interpretations. Some investigators examining the evidence conclude she was guilty. Others, weighing the same facts, insist she was innocent. Many settle on ambiguity. The evidence does not permit certain conclusions. Reasonable doubt should have prevented conviction, yet complete exoneration is equally unwarranted. The case has also been studied for what it reveals about Victorian society, gender ideology, legal procedure, and forensic science. Scholars of women's history see in Florence's trial the intersection of multiple patriarchal mechanisms: legal, social, moral, scientific. Legal historians examine the case for its role in creating momentum for a court of criminal appeal. Historians of science analyze the toxicological evidence and its interpretation. Social historians study the public reaction and what it reveals about Victorian anxieties regarding poison, sexuality, and female criminality. In the end, perhaps the most significant aspect of Florence Maybrick's story is not the question of her guilt or innocence, but the larger patterns her case exemplifies: how societies judge women, how evidence admits multiple interpretations depending on interpretive frameworks, how refinement in education, intended to elevate women, can also constrain and endanger them, how the tools women use to negotiate impossible situations, letters, performance, strategic relationships, can be reinterpreted as evidence of manipulation and guilt. The ritual of writing, folding, sealing, and sending a letter, that gesture repeated throughout Florence's life, now exists only in historical recreation, the practice itself largely obsolete in an age of instant digital communication. Yet the underlying dynamic persists, the vulnerability that comes from putting words on record, the loss of control over how those words will be read, the transformation of private expression into public evidence. Florence's letters, meant to perform social duties or express desperate feelings, became weapons used against her. In an age of emails, texts, and social media posts, the same dynamic operates. Words intended for one audience may be read by others, private communications may become public, and the permanent record can be used for purposes never imagined when the words were first written. The gloves, the letters, the scrapbook, these material objects trace a life, but they trace it incompletely, fragmentarily, always subject to the interpretive frames through which observers choose to see them. Florence Maybrick, trained from childhood to present herself through careful performance, never fully controlled her own image. Others, journalists, prosecutors, reformers, historians, novelists, have continually reconstructed her, using her story to support competing narratives about justice, gender, morality, and truth. She remains, more than 80 years after her death, a figure whose meaning cannot be fixed, whose story cannot be definitively told, whose voice cannot be fully recovered from the documents that purport to preserve it. In a quiet Connecticut cemetery, her grave marker bears her maiden name. The choice, presumably hers, represents a final assertion of identity, not Mrs. Maybrick, the convicted poisoner, not the American wife of Liverpool scandal, but Florence Elizabeth Chandler, the girl who began the journey in Mobile and ended it far from home. The marker, simple and modest, offers no explanation, makes no claim to innocence or guilt, simply records a name and dates. After decades of public scrutiny, public performance, public judgment, the grave offers what life could not: privacy, silence, rest from the endless interpretations that turned her existence into spectacle. The story ends where it began, with an elegant gesture performed under others' observation, with words written for one purpose serving another, with grace offered as evidence rather than accepted as a gift. The gloves are gone, the letters remain, and the question that threaded through her life persists unanswered: how much of a woman's grace can be used as evidence against her? For Florence Maybrick, the answer was all of it.